This is Duke University.
Compulsory pooling or forced pooling laws are a response to a policy challenge presented by the production characteristics of oil and gas. And essentially, they permit the state to compel an unwilling landowner to participate in oil and gas production. And they do this in order to avoid a potential holdout problem that is sort of poorly understood in the economics literature. And these compulsory pooling laws are likely to have important impacts in terms of production efficiency and in terms of the distribution of the rents from the resource production. And again, it's understudied by economists. So oil and gas production in the US since 1895 has been governed by the rule of capture, which recognizes that this resource, as distinct from coal and other hard rock minerals, is migratory. It will move underground from parcel to parcel. And so the Supreme Court has held that it's reasonable that the oil and gas underlying a land tract belongs to the landowner until it migrates away from that land onto another landowner's land. And at that point, that landowner has the right to capture or produce that resource, at which point he's perfected his ownership. This sounds reasonable, but it leads to the following choice for the landowner. Either he can watch his neighbor capture his mineral rights, or he can try and outcompete his neighbor to produce the minerals. And this leads to some perverse outcomes, as captured in this photo of the Spindletop oil field near Beaumont, Texas in 1918. This is clearly inefficient. There's too much, the capital cost of all these wells is too high. There's too much surface area wasted by these wells. They're going to produce too quickly and deplete too quickly the pressure in the reservoir that's so essential for production. So policymakers had to respond to this type of perverse outcome by implementing spacing rules, which limited the density of these wells and the proximity of wells to adjoining land tracts. This, again, is a reasonable response, but then it produces the quandary of what to do with the landowner whose ownership of land whose land tract is too small to produce his resource according to these spacing rules. And so logically then we allow that these landowners might voluntarily pool their tracts in order to produce according to these state rules. But this allows that any particular landowner then might be able to forestall this production. Okay, and this is what we call in economics or in law a holdout problem. And so the response of the state is to use its police power to compel or force pool this holdout into production for just compensation. So generally these landowners who are compelled into production receive sort of a fair market or just compensation for their resources. Okay. So you can think of this as sort of a land assembly problem similar to assembling land on the surface, where the state can exercise police powers to govern in implementing zoning ordinances or in exercising eminent domain in order to sort of achieve some public interest in the development of the surface rights. These compulsory pooling laws are very controversial, as you might expect, because of their coercive nature. Typically, they will require that a threshold percentage of landowners in the drilling unit consent to the production. That is, there's voluntary participation by a given threshold that varies across states between 51% and 90%. And these thresholds are themselves very controversial. Okay. So this, again, however, this holdout problem and the impacts of these laws are not well understood. So I want to think about them in a game theoretic context. That is, I want to model a strategic interaction between an oil and gas firm that I'll call the buyer and the landowners or mineral rights owners, who I call the sellers. And under a set of minimal assumptions, it's likely that this holdout problem will arise in the absence of compulsory pooling. So to fix ideas, let's consider a buyer who bargains sequentially in the drilling unit with landowners. And each seller's land is essential to realizing the gain from production. So that is, the buyer has to assemble all of the parcels of land in the unit. And partial assembly is not efficient. So the individual parcels are more valuable to the individual landowners than they are to the oil and gas company. Okay, so then absent compulsory pooling, this holdout problem is likely. Again, the state has an interest in producing these resources efficiently. With compulsory pooling, it's likely that sellers can do no better than what I call the compulsory pooling price, or this just compensation or fair market value. They can't hold out for higher rents from, or better terms of the contract from the oil and gas company. So this constitutes a shift in the terms of, or in the bargaining power in favor of the oil and gas company, which can just compel this potential holdout into participating. The buyers then are also incented to suppress the prices that they offer for voluntary agreements, because the price that they have to pay to anyone they compel into the unit is governed by these by the prices they offer for these voluntary agreements. So they're going to have an incentive to suppress the prices that they offer in this initial market. And importantly, these voluntary participation thresholds do not affect the production terms or the likelihood of production or the lease terms. So it doesn't matter whether it's a 51% threshold in order to compel landowners to participate or a 90% threshold. Each landowner is going to recognize that if they attempt to hold out for better terms, the buyer can go to other sellers and offer them a contract that's epsilon more valuable than this compulsory pooling price, and induce those other sellers to sell and thereby reach the threshold. Additionally, so I've been modeling the buyers here as monopolists. We might think that the buyers are competing, that is, that there are oil and gas companies competing for this land. If that's the case, then these compulsory pooling laws have no effect on the lease terms. The oil and gas companies, the buyers, are going to bid up the rents, and the sellers are going to capture all of the rents. But the compulsory pooling law won't affect these lease terms. And then finally, these compulsory pooling thresholds are going to create what we in economics might model as a patent race, where if there's complete information, a first mover in a unit is going to have an advantage over potential entrants and thereby be able to discourage or deter entry by these potential competitors, thereby eliminating competition among buyers in the drilling unit. And so these are sort of the propositions that derive from a conceptual model that I'm developing, and I hope to take this to the data.
So I'm going to talk about an ever-expanding research and engagement effort that we have at the Nicholas Institute that's focused on the overarching question of if we as a country are going to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from existing power plants, and the tool we're going to use to do that is the Clean Air Act. The Modern Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970. The last time it's been amended was in 1990. We're going to use the provisions in the Clean Air Act, and we are trying to achieve both a cost-effective regulation and an environmentally meaningful regulation. What are the options under the statute to do so? So forgive me, we aren't going to go too deep into the statute. There is some more relevant language in the Clean Air Act, but not much. Some of the distinctive aspects of this debate are the provisions that are being applied to the existing fleet of power plants. It's very little precedent, so the EPA hasn't used it very much, so there aren't many court decisions, actually no court decisions directly interpreting Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. But this is a slightly separate section, but I want to use this to highlight kind of why the EPA is approaching the question the way that it is and where some of the questions arise. So focusing on the specific language here, so a standard of performance, a performance standard for power plants, must reflect the degree of emission limitation that's achievable through the application of the best system of emission reduction. So the EPA determines what the best system of emission reduction is. Without going into the details of this complicated rule, I think it's enough for this conversation just to say what the EPA has done is it's come up with a formula for determining what are the available options for reducing CO2 from existing power plants, and then applying that formula to the power sector in each state. So each state has an emission target, and those emission targets differ among the states based on what the existing electricity fleet looks like. Now, states then take that target, so they have a number they have to achieve, but they don't have to apply the formula as the EPA applied it to come up with the number. They have to come up with a standard that reflects the degree of emission limitation. Right? So they have to figure out how to get to that number, which creates a fair amount of flexibility. So some choices available to the states, which turns out is a double-edged sword. right? If you are a state regulator, you may prefer to have options available to you so that you can tailor your regulatory program to the electricity sector in your state. But you also have to figure out how you're going to choose among a very wide range of choices. And when you may have limited resources to do so, and with this particular rule, a fairly limited amount of time to make some of those choices. So what are some of the questions you may be looking at? So first off, what's the compliance obligation? Is it based on an emissions rate, so pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour? Is it based on mass, tons of CO2 emitted? Are you going to approach this as a single state, so only looking for options within your state, or are you going to consider options that include options in other states? What if your neighboring state makes a different choice than you do, but you have an electricity grid that is connected across state borders? What is the compliance obligation, and who holds the compliance obligation? So power plants have to take all of the action. Do state programs like renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency policies play a role? What's the role of the Public Utility Commission? So is this an example of environmental regulators playing a much more direct role in electricity sector planning, which is not typically what they do, or is there going to be a role for the Public Utility Commission in the way that they traditionally operate? Markets, so are tradable instruments allowed? And how do these choices fit within the trends that in many states means that there are very rapidly changing electricity sector? So the answer to each one of these questions can have very significant impacts on the future of the electricity sector. And each state, under the proposal, each state has the ability to answer these questions differently, right? So we may have very much a patchwork quilt of policies across the country. The EPA last summer proposed this rule, and this summer, sometime we expect mid-July or sometime into August, the final rule is going to come out. So a lot of our work is trying to work directly with the regulators. We spend most of our time in the sweet tea states, so in the southeast, working with environmental regulators and utility commissioners to help them evaluate some of these options and what the trade-offs may be, using quantitative analysis, so an in-house model that we have that was developed by my colleague Martin Ross. And I should say here, what I'm describing is work that many of my colleagues at the Nicholas Institute have been doing. It's certainly not my own work exclusively. So applying the quantitative analysis, right, trying to put some numbers on what some of the impacts of these choices may be. A key part of this work is getting in the room with the regulators who are going to have to make these choices, making sure it's a non-public meeting so it's not on the record, allowing people to ask questions. Early on in this work, we were doing much more of the posing of questions that they may want to consider as we know that this rule was coming out. Now it's gotten to the point where there's a much more sophistication about the rule, and the questions are coming the other way. The questions are coming from the regulators that are likely going to have to make these choices, asking us to help them figure out what some of the impacts may be. And then there's the role of legal analysis, policy analysis. So what are the options? What's the spectrum of legal certainty or uncertainty if a state chooses one option or another based on the statutory language and also based on the proposed rule? And let me just close with an example of how we do this work. So back to the quantitative analysis. As we work with regulators in fairly conservative states, and certainly where cap and trade is considered a non-starter, if we put up modeling analysis that suggests that approaching this on a multi-state basis as opposed to a state-by-state approach overall is likely to lead to lower compliance costs. But then we get into the political barrier of, well, we can't do something that looks like cap and trade. We can't do a market. That wouldn't fly in our state. How do you achieve the compromise where you get some of the benefits of allowing trading to occur without putting state regulators in the position where they are endorsing markets where they're putting themselves out on a limb? Politically, we have a policy brief that we just published about a month ago where we highlight, building off of renewable energy credit markets and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, some of the design aspects of that, pointing out that there could be ways for states to define compliance instruments the same way, say that utilities can trade. They don't have to, but they can if they want to. And if they trade, the compliance instrument needs to look like X, right? So a ton of CO2, and it has to be recorded on a specific type of tracking system. If each state makes some similar choices like that, they don't have to negotiate with one another, but markets could evolve based on power plant operators' interests in low-cost compliance without putting the state in a position where they are putting themselves out there politically endorsing markets. So just one example of the way that we're trying to engage in this and try to seek some creative problem solving to a pretty complex legal and economic question. Thanks.